Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm so happy to have you here tonight as we gather to hear from Andrew Feiler, whose newest book is called The Better Life for Their Children, Julius, Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 Schools That Changed America. You'll find out really quickly when you hear Mr. Feiler begin to speak that he is a fifth generation Georgian because he's got a nice Southern accent. He grew up Jewish in Savannah, and but he's also lived up north for a brief period of time, went to the University of Pennsylvania, and also lived, I guess, in England, where he had earned a master's in modern history from Oxford University, has a master's in business administration from Stanford University. He made his Southern Jewish parents very proud. And we are so lucky to have him here and to be able to learn from him and hear more about an issue that is important to all of us. I could go on, but really you don't want to hear from me. You want to hear from Mr. Feiler. So it's my pleasure and privilege now to introduce and hand things over to Andrew Feiler. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Rabbi. It's great to be with y'all. Thanks for coming out on this weeknight. This has been an extraordinary run. This book came out in May. It was featured in this amazing double-page spread in the Wall Street Journal. It was in Smithsonian Magazine, either of which are kind of like life milestones for a photographer. It's won a number of awards, and the exhibition of that accompanies the book was up for the latter half of 2021 for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, and it will open February 5th at the Charlotte Museum of History, and from there it moves to Memphis, Nashville, the relatively new Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience in New Orleans. I was just there in December. If you haven't been yet, it's really special. And then the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and that takes me into 2025, and it will travel beyond there. So, and hopefully into the Northeast. So it's been quite a joyous ride, and so I look forward to sharing with you. I'm going to share my screen, and there we go. So I've been a serious photographer most of my life, and about 10 years ago, I started down this path of taking my work more seriously and mercifully being taken more seriously. And my first book was published in 2015, which was broadly about the role that education has played as the on-ramp to the American middle class, and for all Americans. I told that story through images of an abandoned college campus, where there's this dissonance between the fact that these spaces are so familiar to us. We have walked these hallways, we have been in these classrooms, but we're used to seeing them populated by people and not by ghosts. That happened to have been an historically Black college, and so I talk about the role of historically Black colleges, and also this long-standing tradition of education being this central backbone of the American dream. And then I stumbled into this Rosenwald Schools story, which is simply a deeper dive into that narrative. And so I'll tell you more about how I came to the story in a minute. I'm going to start with a photograph of a photograph. This is a portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs on the wall of the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia. That's about an hour up I-75 from Atlanta. Julius Rosenwald is born to Jewish immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Germany. He grows up in Springfield, Illinois, across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home. If you go to downtown Springfield today, there's a 4-square block Lincoln Home National Historic Site where they have preserved all the historic buildings in this 4-square block area. And directly across the street from the Lincoln home is Julius Rosenwald's childhood home. And Peter Ascoli, who's the principal biographer of Julius Rosenwald told me the story that he went down to Springfield and met with the superintendent of the National Historic Site. And they asked him, do you know where Julius Rosenwald's birth home was? And the superintendent says, you're sitting in it. It is actually the offices now of the National Historical Site. At the time, there was not a plaque out in front of this home. Today, there is a plaque, and that plaque was placed there by the campaign to create a Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park. It would have a visitor center in Chicago and 3 Rosenwald schools in each of the program states that had schools, except for Missouri, which only had 3 and has 1 left. And a legislation cleared the Congress at the end of last year, requiring the Secretary of the Interior to do a feasibility study. And when this happens, and it will happen because Dorothy Cantor is the force behind this, and she's a force of nature. When this happens, it will be the first component of the American National Park system to honor a Jewish American. So Julius Rosenwald rises to become president of Sears, Roebuck and Company. And with innovations like satisfaction guaranteed or your money back, he helped turn Sears into the world's largest retailer of its era. And he also became one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. This is a portrait of Booker T. Washington that hangs above the mantle in the president's home of what is now known as Tuskegee University. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery in Virginia, attends Hampton College, becomes an educator, and is the founding principal of the historically Black college in Alabama, originally known as Tuskegee Institute. This is a rare photograph of the 2 men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. And at the rededication ceremony, former students and former teachers and their descendants were invited to sign the quilt. And it hangs today in the restored schoolhouse. In fact, on the cover of my book is an image of the restored classroom in the Pine Grove School. And you can see in the back left-hand corner, this quilt hanging. So Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington meet in 1911, May 18th, 1911, 110 years ago, just last year. And you have to remember, 1911 is before the Great Migration. So 90% of African Americans live in the South. At the end of the Great Migration, at roughly 1970, 56% of African Americans live in the South. It's one of the largest internal displacements of people in human history. And in 1911, 90% of African Americans live in the South, and public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding provided for the education of white children. Many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. And the 2 men, Booker T. Washington invites Julius Rosenwald to come on the board of Tuskegee, and he travels down by train later in 1911 to Tuskegee, is impressed with what he sees, agrees to serve on the board, but the 2 men like each other, and they develop this friendship, and they talk about what can we do together. And in 1912, they create the program that becomes known as Rosenwald Schools. And I want to talk about the structure of the program because there is genius in this structure. Let me first say this is a photograph of students and teachers standing out in front of the Jefferson Jacobs School in Eastern Kentucky. The structure of the program begins with a simple premise that the African American community must be a full partner in their progress. And they reach out to the African American communities and they say, if you will contribute to a school, and we will count as your contribution cash, land, material, or labor. And if you will go to the school board, the white school board, because we want to be deliberate about creating Black-white dialogue as a foundation for future progress, and these have to be public schools. So while we welcome the school system's contribution, at a minimum, they have to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers. If you do those things, Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. Now, before I go on, I want to pause and talk a little bit about this photograph and photographs like them. The program begins with a pilot of 6 schools, all close to Tuskegee, where Booker T. Washington and his team can keep their eye on. And Booker T. Washington has photographs just like these, made of students and teachers standing proudly in front of their schools, carrying the hopes and dreams of their communities, and has them sent to Julius Rosenwald. And Rosenwald writes back that he is so moved by these images that he is committing to expand the program. It is because, and these photographs continue to be made throughout the entire history of this program. These students and teachers in front of their Rosenwald schools, they become part of the visual history of the program, the visual language of the program. All of my bodies of work prior to this body of work were in color, but I chose to shoot this body of work in black and white in recognition and in honor of the role that these black and white images play in the history of this program. And from 1912, when the Lochapoka community in Lee County, Alabama, is the first to raise the match required by the Rosenwald Schools structure and becomes the first Rosenwald school, until 1937, when President Roosevelt presides over the dedication of the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County, Georgia, that's Warm Springs. This program builds 4,978 schools across 15 southern and border states, and the results are transformative. Before I talk about that, I want to tell you a little bit more about the Eleanor Roosevelt School. Franklin Roosevelt, not yet president, in 1929 sees a Rosenwald School in Meriwether County, and he calls up the Rosenwald Fund and says, we need another Rosenwald School in Meriwether County. It's 1929. The recession has set in. The school board is unable to contribute. The African-American community is unable to contribute. And so the idea languishes. 1937, now the formal program actually ends in 1932. So from 1912 to 1932, 20 years, the program builds 4,977 schools. But in 1937, President Roosevelt calls up Edwin Embry, who's running the Rosenwald Fund, and says, okay, I'm ready for my school. And Edwin Embry has to say to President Roosevelt, well, Mr. President, the program formally ended 5 years ago, but for you, Mr. President, we'll make an exception. So this becomes the very last Rosenwald School. The African-American community contributes, the school system contributes, the Rosenwald Fund contributes, the WPA contributes. And the head of the WPA is in the Oval Office reporting to President Roosevelt, who asks about the school, and he is informed that the fundraising is $1,000 short to complete the raise necessary. And in the Oval Office, President Roosevelt pulls out his checkbook and writes the $1,000 check that closes the gap. Now, this school closed in 1972. It was sold to a family that was in the cabinet business. You can see they bricked up the windows. It was used for cabinet storage. And at the time I was shooting this image, the building was for sale and in great distress. And I'm happy to report that in the last year, the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation purchased the property, put preservation easements on it, and has now sold it to a brother-sister team that are working to raise the funds to restore the schoolhouse and turn it into a community center and museum. I said earlier that the results of this program were transformative. There are two economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent Black-white education gap in the South. That gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II, and the single greatest driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, was Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement to come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, multiple members of the Little Rock Nine who integrated Little Rock Central High School all attended Rosenwald schools, as did Congressman John Lewis. So I grew up in Savannah. I left the South after high school and went bouncing around the world for 15 years. But 26 years ago, I moved back to Atlanta. And I have lived in the 5th Congressional District that entire time. And for 25 years, I was a constituent of Congressman Lewis's. And at the time I was working on this project, Congressman Lewis was by far the most renowned alum of the Rosenwald Schools program. And so I reached out to Congressman Lewis and I asked if he would write an introduction to this book. And he said, I'm not sure I'm comfortable writing about the history of Rosenwald schools. I just know I went to school there. I said, Congressman, I will have an essay in this book. And they're essays by two prominent African-American preservationists. We will have the history covered. What I want you to do is what only you can do. Bring us into that classroom. What was it like to go to school there? What role did education play in your life? And he said, oh, I could do that. So it was on October 29th of 2019 that I found myself in Congressman Lewis's office, sitting at the round table in the middle of his office, working on the introduction to this book. And it was exactly 2 months later, on December 29th of 2019, that Congressman Lewis went public with his pancreatic cancer diagnosis. I didn't set out to have this type of experience on this journey, but what an extraordinary gift it was to be able to spend this time with Congressman Lewis working on this project. And because of what ended up unfolding, the introduction to this book by the congressman was one of his last public acts. Now, you're going to see some other portraits, and I'm going to talk about the role of portraiture in a minute in this project, but I want to use this opportunity to just sort of talk a little bit about how I approach portraits. First of all, the setting is important because it's part of the narrative. Congressman Lewis's staff had said to me, can we do this photograph in the Atlanta office? And somewhat boldly, I said no. I wanted it to be in the Washington office because that was a statement of power and a statement of achievement. In addition, I never told anybody what expressions to put on their faces because I wanted them to have agency and how they helped me tell their role in this story. And in addition, I never told anybody what to wear because I wanted them to be authentic. And in fact, in this image, Congressman Lewis had his jacket draped on the back of the chair. He stood up and he put it on, and he has his cancer awareness ribbon on his lapel. And he said, should I take the ribbon off? And I said, Congressman Lewis, I want the authentic you, and that is the authentic you on. And what a powerful coda that turned out to be. So this is the Emory School in Hale County, Alabama, the oldest known surviving Rosenwald school from about 1915. Rosenwald Fund records get much more precise after the first few years, but in the early years, we don't have exact dates for when the schools are constructed, but this is one of the only surviving examples of one of the first two designs for Rosenwald schools. Now, I had never heard of Rosenwald schools until 2015, when I found myself with a woman named Jeannie Syriac, who had originated the role of African-American Heritage Specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office. And she's the first person who told me about Rosenwald schools. And the story shocked me. I'm a fifth-generation Jewish Georgian. I've been a progressive activist my entire life. The pillars of this story are the pillars of my life. How could I never heard of Rosenwald schools? So I came home to this desk, Googled Rosenwald schools, and I found that while there were a number of books on the topic, there was not a comprehensive photographic documentary of this program. And so I set out to do exactly that. The original 4,978 schools, only about 500 survive. Only about half of those have been restored. In over 3.5 years, I drove 25,000 miles across all 15 of the program states, shot 105 of the surviving schools, and the result is this story. So I'm going to take you inside the Emory School, and I want to talk about the architectural idiom of the Rosenwald Schools program, but to do that, I have to tell you about Robert Robinson Taylor. Robert Robinson Taylor was the first African-American to attend MIT, the first accredited African-American architect. And he was hired by Booker T. Washington to be the chief architect at Tuskegee. If you go to Tuskegee today, which is in itself a National Historical Site, many of the beautiful historic buildings on that campus were designed by Robert Robinson Taylor. And Robert Robinson Taylor, by the way, is the great-grandfather of Valerie Jarrett, long a fixture in the civic life of Chicago, and for the entire 8 years of the Obama presidency, a principal aide to President Obama. So Robert Robinson Taylor leads the team of architects that lays out the design principles of Rosenwald schools. Large 9/9 pane windows on the left to let in lots of light because these schoolhouses often did not have electricity. On the right, cloakrooms where dirty outer garments could be left so that they would not sully the education spaces. brick chimneys through which the potbelly stoves vented that kept the schoolhouse warm on chillier days. And you see toward the back there a room divider. That room divider would have originally had in it a series of doors that could be closed off to separate the two education spaces, or accordioned back to open it up so that the schoolhouse could be used as a community center after hours. So this idea of schoolhouse as civic space and this, what is effectively progressive era architecture in service to education, is baked into the program from the very beginning. And those basic design principles continue throughout the entire history of the program. So the Emory School is what's known as a one-teacher school. This is a two-teacher school, the Hope School in Newberry County, South Carolina. The James Hope was the state school superintendent in South Carolina. It was a great supporter of the school, of the Rosenwald Schools program. Every county in South Carolina had Rosenwald Schools, and the Hope family all but donated. They actually sold for $5, which even back then was essentially a donation, the 2 acres of land for the school. After the school closed in 1954, it went into great disrepair, and the grandnephew of James Hope, Ron Hope, who was a career Army officer, retired back to Newberry County, South Carolina, and single-handedly took it upon himself to restore this schoolhouse. If you go today to the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the National Mall, you will find in that museum from this schoolhouse 6 school desks, 1 potbelly stove, and the original sign proclaiming Hope School. This is a 2-teacher school. This is a 3-teacher school, the Pleasant Plains School in Hartford County, North Carolina. Now, the basic design principles of the Rosenwald Schools is that the schools were to be modest. That was in part to save cost, and in part so as to not attract the ire, otherwise known as arson, of the local white citizenry. There was also a more specific guideline, and that is that the schoolhouses were not to have cupolas. That's because one of the architects that shaped the design principles believed that cupolas were derivative of church architecture, and therefore on a schoolhouse, they violated the fundamental American construct of separation of church and state. This schoolhouse has a cupola. Remember, the African American community has to participate, and they count cash, land, material, and labor. This cupola is a reflection of African American community agency in Hartford County, North Carolina in 1920s America. And in fact, of the 105 schools I went to, 3 of them had cupolas. Now, notice that each of these 3 schoolhouses are small white clapboard structures. By the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings. This is the Dunbar School in Pulaski County, Arkansas, otherwise known as Little Rock. And so I started out this journey shooting exterior images. And I soon realized that that's the story that it told was incomplete, because most of these schoolhouses had outgrown their educational purposes long ago. In fact, of the 105 schools that I went to, only 5 are still in use for educational purposes. This is one of them. Dunbar is now a magnet middle school. And by the way, if this Art Deco architecture looks vaguely familiar, it's because the architect of Little Rock Central High was also the architect of the Dunbar School. And it is from this school that several students become some of the members of the Little Rock 9 that integrate Little Rock Central High School. So because so many of these schoolhouses outgrew their educational uses long ago, to be preserved, they had to be adaptively reused. And that became an important part of the narrative, because with so many schoolhouses not restored, there's an inherent plea in this story for preservation. And to tell the adaptive reuse narrative, I had to get inside. And to get inside, I needed permission. And that's when I met all of these extraordinary people, former students, former teachers, preservationists, historians, civic leaders, and I bring their stories into this narrative with portraiture. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this adaptive reuse construct. These are the Pleasant Hill quilters in Cass County, Texas. Three of these women had parents who went to Rosenwald Schools. Three of these women went to Rosenwald Schools. And in the front row in the center, LaJoyce Flanagan was a teacher in this Rosenwald School. The schoolhouse had fallen into disrepair after it closed, and the Pleasant Hill quilters made and sold quilts to raise the money to restore the schoolhouse and to turn it back into the community center, that it is today. And they meet on most Mondays in the schoolhouse to quilt. This is another example of a community center, the Lincoln School in Bledsoe County, Tennessee, that is now an active community center serving the African-American community in its surrounding neighborhoods. Notice these walls and ceilings, all covered in decorative pressed tin. I didn't see that on any other schoolhouse. It's really extraordinary and an incredible statement of the pride this community had in its schoolhouse. And again, a beautiful statement of African-American community agency in 1926 in Eastern Tennessee. Some of these have become were church halls or have become church halls because they were next to churches. The churches often led in either donating the land or raising the money. In this particular case, the Denby School, after it closed, became a church, and the church succeeded and added onto it. And I'll simply tell the story of the family, Beatrice Combs and her family, that actually helped turn this schoolhouse into a church. When my exhibition last month, when the exhibition was still up at the Center for Civil and Human Rights here in Atlanta, the Combs family came down, and I had the privilege of taking them on a tour of the exhibition. It was really quite an extraordinary moment. Some of them have been turned into museums. This is the Warfield School in Montgomery County, Tennessee, a particularly nice restoration with this portrait of Lincoln on the wall. And you see the shadow of these 9/9 frame windows that are such an iconic element of Rosenwald Schools architecture. But many of these schoolhouses remain unrestored. This is the Hannah School that stands across the street from the Hannah AME Church, namesake for the school. The church's graveyard has grown up around the schoolhouse, and in the kind of detail that you just cannot make up. The schoolhouse stands on Deadfall Road, but you see the schoolhouse is in great distress. And these structures, like so many historic structures, are the locus of history and memory and storytelling in a community. When we lose buildings like this, we lose a part of America's soul. And that's why it's so important to preserve these schoolhouses. And indeed, there were times on this journey that I came across schoolhouses that had collapsed so recently that they were surrounded by emergency fencing or yellow caution tape. The W.E.B. Du Bois School in Wake County, North Carolina, in fact, had been demolished a week before I arrived because it had become unstable with this Coke machine standing sentinel in the rubble. This is what happens when we don't focus on saving our history. But as I mentioned, the sort of emotional heart of this story was the incredible people that I met along the way. This is Frank and Charles Brinkley inside the K. Rose School in Sumner County, Tennessee. This portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs above the doorway has hung in this schoolhouse since it opened in 1923. Frank and Charles Brinkley were students in the school. They both went to college. They both went to graduate school, and they both became educators. Frank Brinkley became a high school math and science teacher. Charles Brinkley became a middle school principal. They have 4 sisters, all went to the school, all went to college. These 6 siblings all collectively had 10 children. All 10 children went to college. That legacy may not have happened if it were not for this schoolhouse. This is the Bay Springs School in Forest County, Mississippi. And to tell you the story, this is outside of Hattiesburg. And to tell you this story, I have to tell you the story of Vernon Damer Sr. Vernon Damer Sr. was a student at this school. In fact, his grandfather had donated the 2 acres of land for the school. And when it closed in 1958, the grandfather had been smart enough to build in a reversionary clause. And so the schoolhouse reverted to Vernon Damer, who turned the schoolhouse into a locus of civil rights activism. SNCC met here, the NAACP met here. And Vernon Damer Sr., who was the head of the NAACP in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, when he drove African Americans into Hattiesburg to attempt to register to vote, he would have them park behind the schoolhouse so they could not be identified by their vehicles and harassed. And their son Dennis told me this story that on July 4th of 1964, Freedom Summer, the family on the grounds of this schoolhouse threw a picnic for all of the voter registration volunteers, black and white. Dennis Damer was 11 years old at the time. He said it was the first time he had seen blacks and whites socialize together. As you can imagine, this activity drew the ire of the KKK. And on January 10th of 1966, Vernon Damer's home was firebombed by the KKK. And he stood in the front window with a gun, holding off the attackers while his wife, Ellie, got their children out the back door. And Vernon Damer died as a result of his injuries from that fire. This is Ellie Damer, his widow, who attended a different Rosenwald school in Mississippi, went off to college, came back, and was a teacher in this school, the Bay Springs School. When the school was closed in 1958, because it had built a larger, more consolidated, segregated school 4 years after Brown v. Board in Mississippi, Ellie was denied employment because of her husband's activism. She had to get a job at a different school district 35 miles away. She taught there for 21 years. And their son, Dennis, has recently led the restoration of this schoolhouse and turned it back into a community center befitting its civil rights era roots. And then the last schoolhouse I'm going to talk about is the Hopewell School in Bastrop County, Texas. At the moment, the schoolhouse is undergoing renovation. I'm going to bring you inside. The mottled texture on the walls, that's primer. You see there's plastic sheeting on the floor. The potbelly stove on the right is wrapped in plastic. In the center of this image is a photograph from the 19th century. That is Sophia and Martin McDonald. They were both born into slavery. And upon emancipation, they started raising farm animals. They acquired some land. They acquired some more land. And they eventually acquired 1,200 acres. And when the Rosenwald Schools program came to Bastrop County, Texas in 1919, the family donated 2 acres of land for the school. Its first teacher was their daughter. One of her first students was her daughter, Sophia Williams, shown here on the right, holding up this photograph of her grandparents. Her husband on the left, Elroy Williams, went to a different Rosenwald school in Bastrop County. Both Elroy and Sophia went off to college. They came back and had entire careers as educators in Bastrop County. And now they are in the final throes of restoring the schoolhouse to turn it into a community center and museum. I found this story time and time again. Former students becoming educators, becoming the keepers of flame of history and memory in their communities. And it's stories like this that moved me to write a short story about each of these photographs, in some cases pairs of photographs, because I found Rosenwald Schools with direct connections to the Trail of Tears, the Tuskegee syphilis study, the litigation case of Brown v. Board, murder, embezzlement, and I felt compelled to tell each of those stories. So I hope that you'll spend time with these photographs, but I hope you'll also read the stories, because I think you'll be moved and I think you'll be inspired. I'm going to close with one image that is, this book is about the Rosenwald Schools program. But there is another initiative of Julius Rosenwald that was so impactful that I had to fit it into this story, and that is the Rosenwald Fellowships. The Rosenwald Fellowships existed from 1928 until 1948, and over those 20 years, they gave grants to progressive intellectuals and creatives. 278 of them were progressive white Southerners, like a newspaper editor Ralph McGill and playwright Lillian Smith, but 587 of them are a veritable who's who of African-American culture in the 20th century. Langston Hughes, Jacob Lawrence, Marian Anderson, and Gordon Parks was the first photographer to be awarded a Rosenwald Fellowship. Now, Gordon Parks is essentially one of the most powerful voices in shaping my own photography. It is from Gordon Parks that I learned that you can synthesize your values with your art. And I had the great honor of spending some time with Gordon Parks in 1993 when he was on tour, book tour, for his memoir, Voices in the Mirror. We'll roll forward to today. And here in Atlanta, Georgia, Leslie Parks Bailey, Gordon Parks' daughter, is a friend of me and my wife's. And so I reached out to Leslie and told her I had this idea of bringing her father's story into this story by having her hug a photograph of her dad. And she loved the idea, and she put me in touch with the Gordon Parks Foundation, and they immediately emailed me back this self-portrait, and they said this self-portrait was part of Gordon Parks's Rosenwald Fellowship application. Will this work? Of course, I said, that will do. And so they sent me this image. And but here's the other thing I want to say about this image is I knew from the beginning that I wanted to do it on a manhole, because one of Gordon Parks's seminal bodies of work was a photo illustration he did for Life magazine in 1952, a photo illustration of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and the Invisible Man is coming out from under a manhole. And so I wanted to pay homage to Gordon Parks's work through this imagery, and that's how I came about and constructed that image. So I just want to close with some reflections on the title of this project, A Better Life for Their Children. First of all, I'll tell you briefly the story about how this title came about. I mentioned that there are only 5 Rosenwald schools that are still in use for educational purposes. One of them is the Plaisance School in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana. And I had been to the schoolhouse. It actually was a white 4-teacher white clapboard structure. In 1960, they added onto it these series of 1-story red brick buildings. And I had been to the schoolhouse, and I really didn't like the photograph that I made. It's actually laid out in a way that's very difficult, very awkward to shoot. And so I decided to go back. And I decided for various reasons that the proper way to shoot this image was really early in the morning. And if I'm going to be out in front of a school early in the morning, I better tell somebody I'm coming. So I called up and introduced myself to the principal. I went out there. It was still devilishly difficult to get a good image of the school. But I finally finished, and by then the school day had started, and I went in and introduced myself to the principal. And the principal knew a lot about Rosenwald Schools. And she knew that this schoolhouse was one where the white community and the white school board had done nothing to contribute. 70% of the money had come from the Black community, a Black community that is already being taxed to pay for white schools, that had to dig deep to pay for this school. And the Rosenwald Fund had put up the other 30%. And she says to me, marveling at their commitment to the Black community's commitment to education. They worked and they strove and they did what they could to make a better life for their children, because in their eyes, education was truly liberation. And it's from that conversation that I took this title. But it's equally apt because Julius Rosenwald was looking for a better life for his children. Booker T. Washington was looking for a better life for his children. The Black communities that dug deep to pay for these schools were looking for better lives for their children. These are communities and people who reached across divides of race, religion, and region, and they fundamentally changed this country. And I think that there's an inspiration in this story for this moment in American culture, that individual actions matter, and we can change the world. Congressman Lewis writes in the introduction to this book that each of us have a moral obligation, a mission, and a mandate. Then we see something that is not right and not just, we must find a way to get in the way. And so I will close with Congressman Lewis's most fervent call. May we all find our ways to the path of good trouble. Thank you very much. And I am happy to take some questions.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was like a little speechless for a minute because I was so wowed. I think people will agree by your presentation, and I learned so much, and your pictures are amazing and the stories are incredible. And so I know people have questions. I just wanted to like let out that energy of awe and appreciation for the work and the love that went into this incredible project. And I'm so glad that we brought you here on Martin Luther King Jr. week. It's the perfect, it's the perfect story to be telling and talking about. So with that being said, I want to call on people for questions. If you have a question, Arnie Sucher, do you want to go first?
Yes. What was the demise of this school or the whole program, and when did it really stop, and how and why?
So it's a good question. So first of all, let me just talk a little bit about a way that you can, there's a clue to this story in the way that I structured my images. There's each of the images of schools have a certain title structure. It's the name of the school. These names are really iconic, right? Some of them are named after churches that they are built next to. Some of them are named after famous people in American history. Some of them are named after leaders in the community. Some of them are named after features on the landscape. So it's the school. It's the name of the school, the county, because the money flowed through the county school boards, county and the state, the opening year of the school, but then also the closing year of the school. Many of these schoolhouses were outgrown as educational purposes long ago, and some of the really small, like one teacher schools, were actually closed relatively early because they were replaced with larger schools. But many of these schoolhouses were in use into the late 1960s and early 1970s because the reaction to the two, we talk about Brown v. Board. Brown v. Board is actually two Supreme Court rulings, 1954 and 1955. And those, the response to Brown varies not just by state, but by individual school jurisdiction. Some of these schools closed after Brown, 54, 55, 56. But many of them remained open for a much longer period of time. To go back to the heart of your question, there's a couple of different. So first of all, the Rosenwald Fund itself pivots in 1928. Remember, the core program it starts in 1912, it ends in 1932, but in 1928 they make a pivot. They shift from building to focusing on constructing new schools, to focusing on educational outcomes. So they start funding incentivizing longer school years. They start incentivizing brick construction because they realize these schools are going to be around a lot longer than they had originally anticipated. They start funding libraries in the schools. They start funding school buses. And they start making more investments in historically Black colleges to train teachers for these schools and for all schools. So that's part of why the program ends. Part of it is also, so Julius Rosenwald dies in 1932. And Julius Rosenwald mandated that all of the money would be given away within 15 years of his death, 25 years of his death, because Julius Rosenwald believed that the generation that created the wealth should benefit from the wealth. So he says all the money must be given away within 25 years of his death. That's become very fashionable in philanthropy today. Bill Gates has said that, Warren Buffett has said that. It was unheard of back then. And it's one of the reasons why Julius Rosenwald in this story is less well known than some of Julius Rosenwald's philanthropic peers like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ford. Those foundations carry on those names. And then simply the last thing that I'll say is that most of the schoolhouses, as I mentioned, were really small. That's because the African-American community was not afforded buses. In fact, John Lewis writes in the introduction of this book about walking to school and the school bus with the white children passing him by. That's why these were smaller schoolhouses. And when integration comes, larger consolidated schools are built, these schoolhouses really are too small to be useful. So it's a long answer. It's a multifaceted answer, but it's a good question.
Thank you.
Marcia.
Hi, that was an amazing presentation. I wanted to say a couple of things. One was that many of us had never heard of the Rosenwald Schools until we read Wandering Dixie last year as part of our little Temple book club.
I read that. Great book. It's a fun book.
It is. And so we were very excited when we heard that you had written this and fleshed out the story and illustrated and all. And I also want to say that some of the interior pictures with the desks with the inkwells,
Oh, yes.
going to school in Queens, New York in the 1960s, in my elementary school, we sat at desks just like that. I haven't thought about those in a while. But my question is, you said the way this was all structured, it sort of required the school district with the white people on the school boards buy-in. What got them to cooperate at all?
So the answer actually morphs over time. Early in the program, the white community is not there. Early in the program, almost all the money is coming from the Black community and from Julius Rosenwald. There are some white Southern progressives that are leading some of these school districts, and that sort of catalyzes it in the early years of the program. As time goes on, two things happen. Number one, the amount of money that Julius Rosenwald is putting into this program creates political cover for the white leadership to contribute to the schools. But then what happens is the Great Migration is accelerating, and the South is losing its workforce. And the white community comes to understand that if it's going to keep its workforce, it has to provide better educational opportunities for the children. And that plays a major role in the expansion. And but here's the thing, at the end of the program, only 15% of the money actually comes from Julius Rosenwald. The Black community is given 17% of the money. The white community itself gave 4% of the money. 64% of the money actually comes from public funds. So in the end, and here's another, this is a short, so if you take the 14 core program states, I'm taking out Missouri because it joins the program late, there's only 3 Rosenwald schools in Missouri. 14 program states, 2/3 of all counties in those states had Rosenwald schools. And if you take the counties that had significant African-American school-age populations, 85% of counties had Rosenwald schools. In some states like South Carolina, there was an average of 10 Rosenwald schools per county. In North Carolina, there were 8 Rosenwald schools per county. And so this program is really pervasive. And and a lot of that has to do with the genius of the design that Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington create together. Think about this. The Black community has to contribute. This is one of the earliest examples of challenge grants in American history. The white school board has to play ball. This is one of the earliest examples of public-private partnership in American history. It's really genius in the structure.
Marcia, did you have a follow-up comment or no? Okay. Any other questions or comments? I know we're all, I can't believe it's like what you said, and like, I can't believe that I didn't know about these schools. Is anyone here, did anyone hear of these schools before tonight even? Or is this new of relatively new impression for all of you? Yes, Judith Estrin, you just unmuted yourself. Did you mean to?
Yes.
Okay.
We heard about it through Susan Stolman, who is a relative of that Rosenwald family, and she lives in Columbia, and she's always spoken about it. So it's terrific to see, this live, if you will. But that's how I heard about it, if you will.
Thank you, Bela.
Yeah, I did write something in the comments that said that, I said the same thing, that we read Wandering Dixie, and that was the first time I heard of them, although as a social worker, I knew who Julius Rosenwald was, and I know what a philanthropist he was, and he also supported many Jewish causes as well. But I was so fascinated with her book and with the story of the schools. And then, when we were having you come to speak, I was so excited. It was really it's just very moving just to even see the schools and think about how they came to be and how many lives they touch. It's really just an amazing story. So thank you so much for sharing it and for taking on the project and presenting it. I hope more people find out about it because it's really a wonderful story. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. We'll spread the word. This is because of the you know, a lot of books come out and there's a season and then the next season comes along. When you have a museum show that's traveling, it kind of makes it a longer story. This exhibition is going to travel for a decade. And you can follow, books can be, they're available on Amazon and other places and independent bookstores, but you can also buy personalized and signed copies on my website. It's just andrewfeiler.com. Strangely, in this world of the internet, there are 2 other Andrew Feilers who are photographers, which, as you can imagine, kind of drives me crazy. But I at least have the domain name andrewfeiler.com. But you can follow. I keep my the exhibition schedule updated there. And you can also follow me on social media, where I'm posting about Rosenwald School restoration efforts and other sort of tidbits about Rosenwald Schools.
Is there anyone, Mr. Estrin?
Yeah, Andrew, I'd like to ask you, what was your academic background and what did you do for a living all these years? And how did you get into this particular subject?
So I've had a winding career path. I basically have lived my life with one foot in the public sector and one foot in the private sector. I worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Sam Nunn in defense policy, and then I was on Wall Street in an investment bank, working in strategic planning for the bank holding company. And then I went to graduate school. And so, as you can imagine, with that kind of background, I went and did one degree for my public sector life and one for my private sector life. I went and did a history degree at Oxford, and then it's actually a degree in American political history from 1865 to 1965. And then I did an MBA at Stanford, and then I was in management consulting, and then I did a tech startup. And then my dad got sick, and I, for the last 20 years, have spent part of my time running a family real estate business. So but I'm very involved in the civic life of my community. I'm very involved in the nonprofit world, very involved in the political world. And as I started down this path of trying to take my photography more seriously and mercifully being taken more seriously, I had to find what my voice was as a photographer. And what I found was that the topics that I was drawn to were an extension of my civic life. And so now what my art has come to be at this intersection of history, activism, and art.
So I just want to remind everyone, the name of the book is called A Better Life for Their Children. And I'm going to be sending out, this program was recorded. And if you think if you know somebody who might be interested in watching it, I'm going to be sending all of you a link to the recording, a link to Andrew's website, a link to buy the book on Amazon, but our preference would be for you to buy it through Andrew or at least through an independent bookstore instead. But buy it no matter what, and just, you know, and tell the story. It says, Barbara Aharoni, I'm bringing this to a close, but there were 2 more questions, and maybe you can bring this, finish Andrew with answering some of these questions. 1, did the Jewish communities in towns participate? And 2, what was the teaching style in the schools? Was it like every other school for any other kid, or was there something specific?
So it's a good, I don't know. I actually don't know the answer to the question about the Jewish community being involved. It's the first time I've been asked that question. I've read 41 books on this topic, and that has actually not come up. So I don't know if there's any literature on that topic. It's a good question. As far as the teaching is concerned, these are Black teachers in Black schools. And there's 2 important things about that fact. Number 1, these teachers were teaching equality. And they help set this expectation of equality, which plays in itself an enormous role in the civil rights movement in establishing the expectation that all people were indeed created equal. And so that's an unheralded role that these teachers play. The second thing is that in the litigation of Brown v. Board, the way we are told the history is that Thurgood Marshall and his team of attorneys are the heroes. There were associations of teachers, Black associations of teachers, who gathered the school level data and funneled it up to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund And it was that data that helped Thurgood Marshall and his team make the case that separate but equal was inherently unequal. Ellie Damer was one of those teachers. I spent 2 hours with her and her son Dennis inside the Bay Spring School, and she told me about how this network of teachers, Black teachers associations worked. And so again, this is another critical role that the teachers play. And so since we're at the end, I'm going to close on one particular thought, and that is, something that I've learned from this program as somebody who's involved in civic activism. The thing that jumps out at me more than anything else in this program is Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington are building schools for African Americans in the Jim Crow South of 1912 America. That is a deeply optimistic act. That is a multi-generational act. And to me, what I find most inspiring about this story is this and I think about how we tend to think in America problems are intractable, but this combination of optimism and long ball, to me, is the most inspiring aspect of this story, and it's what I bring to my civic work. Be optimistic, play long ball. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Andrew Feiler. The book, again, A Better Life for Their Children. I love that expression, a deeply optimistic act. That's what we need. You just think about, an African-American who was born a slave, a young, a Polish Jewish guy, who came here with nothing and, ended up becoming one of the greatest philanthropists. To be able to do this, it was truly a deeply optimistic act, and it is a reminder that almost anything is possible if we make it so. So thank you so much, Mr. Feiler. Just a very quick announcement about our 2 programs coming up in the month of February. On February 2nd, our book club event with author Naomi Reagan, who is the author of many books, including the book called An Observant Wife. She's coming to us. Normally our programs are at 8 p.m., but she's coming to us from Jerusalem. So that program is actually at 11 a.m. And I'll just say that there is a prequel to her book, An Unorthodox Match. And the name of it is not coming to me, but Marcia, you can unmute yourself and say it.
It was, the prequel is An Unorthodox Match. The book itself, the second book, is An Observant Wife.
An Observant Wife. Okay, so read both if you can beforehand, if you'd like. They're both really interesting reads if you like novels. And then on February 16th at 8 p.m. we have Jonathan Boyarin coming to speak to us about his book Yeshiva Days, which is about the year he spent as a student and observer at a yeshiva in Manhattan's Lower East Side. A totally different kind of book than this one, but I'm sure fascinating in its own way. Anyway, thank you again, Andrew Feiler. Again, the book is A Better Life for Their Children. Stay warm and stay safe. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Good night, everybody, and thank you.